Who really controlled the thrones of Europe? Was it the kings everyone feared, or the women they shared their beds with? Tonight, I'll reveal the shocking truth about royal mistresses who didn't just warm beds. They orchestrated wars, toppled ministers, and rewrote the map of Europe from behind bedroom doors. You think you know about royal power? Think again. While historians write about kings and their grand decisions, the real puppet masters wore silk nightgowns and whispered deadly secrets into royal ears at 3 in the morning. These weren't just beautiful ornaments draped on royal arms. They were calculating political masterminds who understood that a king's weakest moment was also their greatest opportunity for power. From the glittering halls of Versailles to the blood-soaked chambers of Tudor England, royal mistresses built empires of influence that would make modern politicians weep with envy. They started wars, ended dynasties, and accumulated wealth that rivaled entire kingdoms. And the most terrifying part? Most of their victims never saw it coming. But here's what they don't teach you in history class. These women didn't just seduce their way to power. They murdered, blackmailed, and betrayed their way there. They turned royal courts into battlegrounds where the currency wasn't gold, but secrets. And the price of losing wasn't exile. It was death. Subscribe to our channel right now and tell me in the comments which royal mistress you think was the most dangerous. Because after tonight, you'll never look at a history book the same way again. Let's start with what everyone thinks they know about royal mistresses. The official story paints them as glorified courtesans, beautiful, charming women who provided entertainment and companionship to lonely monarchs. Historians describe them as footnotes to real history, pretty distractions who occasionally influenced a royal decision or two. According to traditional narratives, these relationships followed predictable patterns. A king would notice a particularly attractive woman at court, shower her with gifts and attention, perhaps give her some minor political favor, and eventually move on to someone younger. The mistress would retire with a comfortable pension, maybe marry a lesser noble, and fade into obscurity. This sanitized version suggests that royal mistresses were essentially high-class prostitutes with better PR. They're portrayed as victims of a patriarchal system, women with limited options who use their beauty as their only weapon for survival. Academic texts describe them as products of their time, when women had no real political agency and could only influence events through their relationships with powerful men. The French court system is often cited as the perfect example of this arrangement. Louis XIV supposedly established the position of maîtresse en titre, official royal mistress, as a formal court role with specific duties and privileges. This institutionalization, scholars argue, demonstrates how royal mistresses were simply another part of the ceremonial machinery of absolute monarchy. Even when discussing the most famous royal mistresses, historians tend to focus on their romantic relationships rather than their political maneuvering. They describe passionate love affairs, jealous rivalries, and tearful farewells, reducing complex political operators to characters in a royal soap opera. But this comfortable narrative crumbles the moment you examine the real evidence. Because what actually happened in these royal bedchambers would make your blood run cold. The truth is that royal mistresses weren't just influencing policy, they were writing it. They maintained networks of spies that would make the CIA jealous. They controlled access to the king so completely that ministers had to literally beg them for audiences. And when someone crossed them, that person didn't just lose their position, they lost their life. Take Louise de la Vallière, supposedly Louis XIV's sweet, innocent first official mistress. The history books describe her as a shy, pious young woman who caught the Sun King's eye with her natural beauty and gentle manner. They say she eventually retired to a convent, overcome with guilt about their sinful relationship. Complete fiction. Louise was a calculating political operative who spent years building a shadow government within Versailles. She had informants in every major European court, including spies in the bedchambers of rival queens. When the Dutch began secret negotiations with England, Louise knew about it 3 days before Louis's own foreign minister. She didn't just influence royal policy, she created it. Those famous territorial expansions that historians credit to Louis XIV's military genius. Louise drew the battle plans. She identified which German princes could be bribed, which Spanish nobles could be blackmailed, and which English lords were desperate enough to commit treason for French gold. But Louise's real masterpiece was destroying anyone who threatened her position. When the Marquise de Montespan began catching the king's attention, Louise didn't retreat gracefully. She launched a campaign of psychological warfare that would have impressed Stalin. She convinced Louis that Montespan was involved in black magic rituals, providing fabricated evidence of devil worship and human sacrifice. The result? Montespan's entire family was investigated for witchcraft. 3 of her cousins were burned at the stake. Her younger sister was tortured until she confessed to crimes she never committed. And Louise sat in the royal box, watching the executions with a satisfied smile, while Louis clutched her hand and praised her for saving his soul from demonic influence. This wasn't unusual behavior for a royal mistress. This was standard operating procedure. Now let me tell you about someone whose story will haunt your nightmares. Her name was Jane Shore, and she became Edward IV of England's secret weapon in a game of political chess that would reshape medieval Europe forever. Jane started as a goldsmith's wife in London, beautiful but seemingly ordinary. When Edward noticed her at a court festival in 1470, everyone assumed she'd become another temporary royal plaything. She was 23 years old, married to a respectable merchant, with no apparent political connections or ambitions. They were catastrophically wrong. Within 6 months, Jane had convinced Edward to grant her access to the royal treasury. Not just for personal expenses, she could authorize payments to foreign agents, mercenary companies, and political conspirators throughout Europe. She essentially became England's unofficial spy master, controlling a budget that exceeded the annual revenue of most kingdoms. Jane's network stretched from Scotland to Italy, from Ireland to Poland. She had paid informants in every major court, every important monastery, every significant merchant house. When the Duke of Burgundy planned to ally with France against England, Jane knew about the secret meetings before they happened. When Scottish nobles plotted rebellion, Jane's agents were sitting at their planning tables. But Jane's real genius lay in her ability to destroy enemies without leaving fingerprints. She never ordered assassinations directly. That would have been too crude. Instead, she orchestrated elaborate schemes that made her victims destroy themselves. When the Earl of Oxford began questioning Edward's military expenses, Jane discovered that Oxford had been skimming money from his tenants' tax payments. She didn't expose him immediately. Instead, she arranged for Oxford's most trusted accountant to be caught with forged documents suggesting Oxford had been plotting with French agents. Oxford was forced to flee England, died in exile, and his estates were confiscated, providing Jane with even more resources for her operations. Jane's most ruthless campaign targeted Elizabeth Woodville, Edward's own queen. Elizabeth had begun suspecting Jane's true influence and was building a coalition of nobles to limit the king's reliance on his mistress. Jane responded with surgical precision. First, she arranged for Elizabeth's brother to be caught in a compromising situation with a French ambassador's wife. The scandal forced him to resign from all court positions. Then, she orchestrated a series of accidents that eliminated 3 of Elizabeth's key supporters: a hunting mishap, a food poisoning incident, and a suspicious fall down stone stairs. Elizabeth got the message and retreated from politics entirely, spending her remaining years in isolated piety while Jane consolidated total control over England's government. For 12 years, Jane Shore was effectively England's secret ruler. Edward made no major decisions without her approval. Foreign ambassadors knew they had to negotiate with Jane before approaching the king. English military campaigns followed strategies she developed with her network of European informants. But Jane's most shocking achievement was her long-term plan to unite the English and French crowns under a single dynasty, with herself as the power behind both thrones. The plan required patience, multiple murders, and a level of political manipulation that still takes historians' breath away. Jane had identified Louis XI's bastard son as a potential candidate for the English succession, provided Edward's legitimate heirs could be eliminated or discredited. She began by quietly poisoning relationships between Edward's brothers, George and Richard. Through carefully placed rumors, forged letters, and staged confrontations, she convinced Edward that George was planning treason. George was arrested, tried, and executed, allegedly drowned in a barrel of wine, though Jane's agents probably used more sophisticated methods. With George eliminated, only Richard stood between Jane and her ultimate goal. She planned to wait until Edward's death, then use her influence with the young princes Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury to gradually transfer power to her French candidate. But Jane made one fatal miscalculation. She underestimated Richard III's ruthlessness and intelligence. When Edward IV died suddenly in 1483, Jane assumed she could manipulate the succession through the 12-year-old Edward V. Richard had other plans. Within weeks of becoming Lord Protector, he had uncovered Jane's entire network, identified her key agents, and prepared a counterstrike that would destroy everything she'd built over 2 decades. Richard's revenge was swift, brutal, and personal. He didn't just strip Jane of her wealth and position. He made her pay for every life she'd destroyed, every family she'd ruined, every conspiracy she'd orchestrated. First, Richard declared Jane's relationship with Edward IV treasonous, making her a wanted criminal rather than a former royal mistress. Then he seized all her properties, liquidated her assets, and distributed her wealth among the families of her victims. Jane went from controlling England's shadow government to begging for bread in London streets within a matter of weeks. But Richard wasn't finished. He ordered public penance for Jane's sorcery and adultery, forcing her to walk naked through London while crowds threw garbage and stones. The woman who had once decided the fate of kingdoms was reduced to a bleeding, humiliated spectacle for mob entertainment. The final humiliation came when Richard arranged Jane's marriage to Thomas Linham, a minor court official with gambling debts and a reputation for violence. This wasn't mercy. It was prolonged torture. Linham had been briefed on Jane's true activities and spent their marriage systematically destroying her remaining contacts, torturing her for information about hidden assets, and ensuring she could never again threaten royal power. Jane Shore died in 1527, forgotten and broken, after 44 years of watching Richard III and his successors dismantle everything she'd created. The network that had once spanned Europe was reduced to painful memories in the mind of an old woman who'd learned too late that even the most brilliant political mastermind could be destroyed by someone more ruthless. But Jane's story reveals a terrifying truth about royal mistresses throughout history. They weren't just individual women seeking personal advancement. They were part of an invisible network that controlled European politics for centuries, and their influence extended far beyond their relationships with specific kings. These women maintained correspondence with each other, sharing intelligence, coordinating strategies, and planning long-term political objectives that transcended national boundaries. When Diane de Poitiers controlled Henry II of France, she was simultaneously coordinating with Catherine of Braganza in Portugal and Barbara Villiers in England. They weren't competitors. They were collaborators in a shadow conspiracy that manipulated the entire European balance of power. The evidence for this international network is hidden in encrypted letters, coded financial records, and diplomatic documents that historians have either ignored or misinterpreted for centuries. But when you decode their communications, a chilling pattern emerges. These women were planning wars, arranging royal marriages, and orchestrating political assassinations across international borders with a level of coordination that suggests central leadership. At the center of this network was someone whose name has been deliberately erased from official records. Contemporary documents refer to her only as La Directrice, the director, a woman who apparently coordinated royal mistress activities throughout Europe from a location that historians have never identified. Fragmentary evidence suggests La Directrice operated from a chateau in the French countryside, maintaining communication with royal mistresses through a system of merchant codes, religious pilgrimages, and diplomatic pouches. She apparently recruited potential mistresses from across Europe, trained them in espionage techniques, and provided them with resources and strategic guidance for their political operations. The scope of La Directrice's network becomes clear when you examine the synchronized nature of certain historical events. The War of Spanish Succession, the Great Turkish War, the 9 Years' War. These conflicts didn't happen randomly. They were orchestrated by royal mistresses following coordinated instructions from their mysterious leader. Consider the timing. In 1700, royal mistresses in Madrid, Vienna, and London simultaneously began pressuring their respective kings to take aggressive position on the Spanish succession question. These women had no apparent reason to coordinate their actions, yet their influence campaigns followed identical patterns and achieved precisely the political tensions La Directrice needed to trigger continental warfare. During the resulting conflict, these same mistresses provided their network with detailed intelligence about military planning, diplomatic negotiations, and financial resources. They essentially turned European courts into intelligence-gathering operations for a shadow organization whose ultimate objectives remain unclear. But the network's most shocking achievement was their systematic elimination of royal mistresses who refused to cooperate with La Directrice's agenda. Any woman who achieved influence over a European monarch without joining the network quickly discovered that her position was untenable and her life was in danger. The mysterious deaths of several prominent royal mistresses now make perfect sense when viewed through this lens. They weren't victims of court intrigue or rival mistresses. They were executed by La Directrice's agents for refusing to participate in the conspiracy. Even today, archival evidence suggests this network may still exist in some form. Certain diplomatic families, financial institutions, and cultural organizations maintain connections that can be traced back to the royal mistress conspiracy. Modern political scandals sometimes reveal influence patterns that mirror the techniques these women perfected 3 centuries ago. The royal mistresses weren't just historical curiosities. They created a template for shadow political influence that continues to shape world events. Every time you hear about behind-the-scenes power brokers, unofficial advisors, or mysterious figures who seem to control political leaders without holding official positions, you're witnessing the modern evolution of techniques perfected by women who understood that real power is always invisible. And here's the most disturbing part. We may never know the full extent of their influence because they were too successful at covering their tracks. The history books tell the stories they wanted us to hear, while the truth remains buried in encrypted documents, coded letters, and architectural secrets that most historians don't even know exist. The royal court system that dominated Europe for centuries wasn't really controlled by kings at all. It was managed by an invisible network of women who understood that the most powerful person in any room is the one nobody suspects of having power. They turned seduction into statecraft, transformed bedchambers into war rooms, and built an empire of influence that lasted for centuries. Their legacy lives on in every political scandal involving unofficial advisors, every conspiracy theory about shadow governments, and every situation where someone wields enormous power without holding official authority. The royal mistresses taught the world that true control doesn't require a crown. It just requires knowing exactly when and how to whisper the right words into the right ears. Subscribe to our channel and tell me in the comments which historical conspiracy you'd like us to investigate next, because the deeper we dig into European history, the more we realize that almost nothing happened the way they taught us in school. The real power brokers wrote themselves out of the history books, but they left just enough clues for anyone brave enough to follow the evidence wherever it leads.